The Dominion fleet arrived in Earth's orbit with the precision of a celestial executioner. From the bridge of the dreadnought, unyielding will, General Zeltar watched the blue-green world spin beneath him, its surface shrouded in thick clouds. His mandibles clicked in amusement as he turned to his second-in-command, Subcommander Vrash. "This planet is little more than an overgrown rock," Zeltar said, voice humming with condescension. "And its inhabitants? Fragile, primitive creatures clinging to their mud and stone." Vrash nodded, tapping a claw against the holomap projected before them. "Their technology is rudimentary at best. They rely on combustion-based weaponry, incapable of piercing our armor. Our landing forces will encounter no real resistance." Zeltar allowed himself a slow, deliberate stretch, his plated exoskeleton catching the dim glow of the ship's artificial lighting. The Dominion had crushed dozens of worlds with similar levels of development, their campaign swift and unchallenged. Earth would be no different. The only concern, if it could even be called that, was the planet's dense biomes. Swamps, mountains, vast oceans, and, most notably, jungles that covered entire continents in tangled, uncharted wilderness. He had heard murmurings of previous scouting parties, struggling with terrain interference, their transmissions garbled by unpredictable electromagnetic fluctuations. But to Zeltar, it was an irrelevant detail. The jungle could not fight. When the invasion commenced, the Dominion forces deployed in perfect formation, descending in towering dropships that slammed into the rainforest with arrogant finality. Metallic legs crushed ancient trees beneath them, toppling trunks like brittle twigs. Squads of biomechanical infantry emerged in disciplined ranks, their sleek armor gleaming even under the oppressive canopy. They moved with the cold efficiency of an empire that had never known defeat, plasma rifles held at the ready, scanning for resistance. There was none. The human military, clearly outmatched, had withdrawn from major urban centers, retreating deep into the jungles. Dominion scouts tracked their movements, reporting small, scattered groups moving through the undergrowth. The humans were weak, their strategy one of desperation rather than defiance. And yet, something about their retreat unsettled Vrash. Unlike other conquests, where panicked masses surrendered in droves or mounted futile last stands, the humans did not behave as expected. There was no pleading for mercy, no terrified transmissions begging for ceasefire. They simply vanished. Days passed, and frustration seeped into the Dominion ranks. Patrols sent into the jungle reported malfunctions with their equipment. Communications crackled with static. Heat scanners, normally capable of detecting life forms from orbit, were overwhelmed by the sheer biomass of the rainforest. Even aerial surveillance proved unreliable. Drones sent to map the jungle often failed to return, disappearing without explanation. Then the disappearances began. At first, they were dismissed as accidents. Perhaps an unlucky soldier strayed too far from his unit, or an equipment failure led to an unfortunate mishap. But as more troops went missing, patterns emerged. Entire squads failed to report in. When search teams were dispatched, they found nothing. No bodies, no weapons, not even footprints. It was as if the jungle had swallowed them whole. Zeltar was not amused. He had expected a swift occupation, not a campaign of attrition against an invisible enemy. Reports of casualties, though minimal compared to the Dominion's full strength, irritated him. Vrash, ever the pragmatist, recommended purging the rainforest entirely. "Firebombing is a logical course," he insisted. "We cannot fight what we cannot see. The jungle provides them sanctuary. We should deny them that advantage." Zeltar disagreed. "These creatures cannot evade us forever. Let them scurry in the shadows. It changes nothing. The outcome remains inevitable." He would not squander resources on what amounted to pest control. The Dominion had conquered planets where the atmosphere itself was toxic, where mountains bled lava, where storms ripped through steel like paper. The idea that Earth's unrefined wilderness could pose a meaningful obstacle was laughable. He would soon regret that arrogance. That night, The Dominion encampment stirred with unnatural tension. The air hung thick with humidity, the distant cries of unseen creatures echoing through the trees. Troops remained at their posts, their bioluminescent visors scanning for movement. The jungle was never silent, but tonight, something about its noises felt deliberate. A soldier, standing at the perimeter, stiffened. His rifle twitched slightly as his visor flickered. Something moved in the trees, just beyond the reach of his sensors. He activated his infrared overlay, but the jungle's residual heat made it useless. He hesitated. A whisper of air, a razor-thin cord snapped taut around his throat, pulling him backward into the foliage. His body was gone before he could make a sound. Less than a minute later, another soldier disappeared. Then another. No gunfire. No alarms. Just the steady, methodical unraveling of the Dominion's presence. Zeltar awoke to chaos. His command post, once a bastion of order, was filled with frantic reports. Troops missing, equipment sabotaged, patrols vanishing before they could even call for help. The jungle, which had once seemed an inert, meaningless obstacle, now pressed in on them, alive with unseen danger. He clenched his mandibles. Enough. Vrosh hesitated before speaking. General, we may be facing an enemy unlike any we have encountered before. Zeltar's gaze snapped to him, unreadable. Do not tell me you fear savages hiding in the trees. I fear an enemy that understands its battlefield better than we do. Outside, the jungle remained unchanged. The trees stood tall, their branches shifting slightly in the wind. Somewhere beyond them, in the darkness where Dominion technology could not see, something watched. The jungle did not belong to the Dominion. It never had. Deep beneath the emerald canopy, where the light of alien warships could not reach, a dozen human figures moved in perfect silence. Faces smeared with mud, bodies camouflaged with leaves and shadows, they became part of the forest itself. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. They were more than soldiers. They were hunters. Captain Elias Navarro crouched low, fingers tracing the damp soil. He could feel the vibration beneath his palm, the steady, arrogant march of Dominion patrols, their heavy footfalls betraying their ignorance. They moved as conquerors, believing their technology made them untouchable. Navarro smirked. Technology meant nothing here. He gestured with 2 fingers, and his team melted into the underbrush. Sergeant Renaud Coyer, a demolitions expert, pressed close to a moss-covered tree, setting a microcharge the size of a playing card along its roots. Corporal Martinez, their sharpshooter, climbed higher into the canopy, vanishing among the tangled vines. Even with augmented vision, even with heat scans, the Dominion wouldn't see them. The jungle had already swallowed them whole. Minutes later, the first alien patrol arrived. They were disciplined, moving in a stagger formation, rifles sweeping the undergrowth. Their armor, sleek and insectal, reflected the faint bioluminescent fungi growing along the jungle floor. They had numbers. They had firepower, but they had no understanding of where they stood. Navarro waited, counting heartbeats. The aliens moved beneath Martinez's position. Another second, then another. A single crack split the air. One of the Dominion soldiers dropped, a silent hole punched clean through its visor. The others tensed, scanning wildly. No muzzle flash, no energy signature. To them, it was as if their comrade had simply ceased to exist. Confusion rippled through their ranks. Then came the explosion. The microcharge beneath the roots erupted, not in a violent blast, but in a controlled detonation designed to send a rotting tree crashing down into their formation. They barely had time to shout before the massive trunk obliterated their ranks, scattering bodies like broken dolls. Panic. Navarro struck before they could recover. A blade flashed in the darkness, slicing through the tubing of an alien's breathing apparatus. Okoye moved in tandem, silenced pistol spitting 2 rounds into a Dominion officer's throat. The jungle became a graveyard before the enemy even understood they were in a battle. A single survivor staggered back, trembling, his mandibles clicking in terror. His weapon trembled in his grip as his 4 black eyes darted wildly. He spun, trying to find the enemy, but there was nothing. Just the jungle, the trees, the whispers in the wind. Then Navarro's voice, calm and deadly, spoke from the darkness. "You don't belong here." The alien turned to flee. He didn't make it 5 steps before a wire snare yanked him into the canopy, his screams vanishing into the night. Silence returned. The team gathered swiftly, dragging bodies into the underbrush, wiping away any trace of their presence. They had studied the Dominion's protocols, their response times. Another patrol would come within the hour, and when they did, they would find nothing but empty ground and the echo of their fallen. Navarro knelt beside the officer's body, plucking a comm device from the corpse. He handed it to Okoye, who nodded, already setting to work bypassing its encryption. Intelligence was everything. Fear was a weapon, and they would wield it ruthlessly. "They don't know what they're fighting," Martinez murmured from above, still keeping watch. "They think they do," Navarro replied, standing. "That's what makes it fun." In the Dominion camp, the losses were felt like a slow, creeping poison. Reports of missing patrols stacked higher each day. The jungle offered no clues, no bodies, no evidence of struggle. Commanders barked orders, demanded results, but the truth was undeniable. Something was hunting them. General Zeltar's patience had worn thin. He stood in the center of the command pavilion, glaring at the flickering holomap displaying their shrinking patrol routes. Every attempt to establish a perimeter had been met with failure. His forces were being picked apart, reduced not by direct assault, but by an unseen force that defied all military logic. "Explain this," he hissed, mandibles twitching. "Where are my soldiers?" Sub-Commander Vrash hesitated. It was the first time Zeltar had ever seen fear in his lieutenant's eyes. "General, I believe the humans are employing unconventional tactics." Zeltar's claws curled into a fist. "You mean to say these primitives have managed to outmaneuver an empire that has conquered half the galaxy?" Vrash's throat bobbed. He did not answer. Another officer, a communications specialist, stepped forward, his movements stiff. "Sir, we intercepted something. A transmission." Zeltar turned sharply. "From where?" "We don't know. It piggybacked off one of our own frequencies." It was deliberate. A flicker of unease passed through the gathered officers. Zeltar gestured sharply. "Play it." A burst of static filled the air. Then a voice. "Cold. Human. You are not the hunters here." "We are. Run while you still can." The transmission ended. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. Zeltar's claws dug into the console. For the first time in his long and decorated military career, he realized something he had never once considered possible. He was not fighting a war. He was being hunted. The jungle burned. Columns of fire rolled through the underbrush, consuming ancient trees and sending thick plumes of smoke curling into the sky. Dominion warships hovered above the inferno, their thrusters kicking up ash, while ground troops advanced in cautious formations, weapons raised. No more patrols. No more isolated squads. The Dominion had learned its lesson. Now they moved in overwhelming force, sweeping the rainforest with flamethrowers, pulse grenades, and aerial bombardments. The jungle had given the humans cover, so they would take the jungle away. From the scorched remains of a clearing, General Zeltar watched with cold satisfaction. He had underestimated these creatures, allowed them to dictate the terms of engagement. That mistake would not be repeated. The humans were masters of concealment, striking from the shadows before vanishing without a trace. Very well. He would ensure there were no shadows left to hide in. "Expand the burn radius," he ordered. "Clear everything within 20 clicks." Sub-Commander Vrash hesitated. "General, such an approach will drain considerable resources. We will need to resupply." Zeltar's mandibles clicked in irritation. "Do you question my judgment?" Vrash stiffened. "No, sir. Only we have yet to recover a single body. Zeltar turned, fixing his lieutenant with all four of his black, gleaming eyes. Explain. Our casualties, Vrash said, voice carefully measured, continue to vanish, even those felled in open engagements. Our scanners detect no traces, no remains. It is as if they are simply erased. Zeltar's claws curled. The enemy's ability to disappear had been frustrating, but this was different. This was something else. We are being studied, Vrash continued. They are learning, adapting. Zeltar exhaled sharply. He would not be outplayed by savages lurking in the trees. Then we burn faster than they can learn. But even as he spoke, unease coiled in his gut. The jungle burned, but something watched from the embers. Navarro wiped soot from his face, eyes narrowing as Dominion troops advanced through the charred remains of the jungle. He crouched behind a fallen trunk, his team spread out in the shadows, watching. The enemy had changed their tactics, shifting from arrogance to aggression. No more complacency, no more easy kills. The Dominion was adapting. Good. Okoye's voice crackled in his earpiece. They're pushing hard. We won't be able to use the old paths much longer. We won't need them, Navarro murmured. He motioned toward the approaching formation. They think fire makes them untouchable. Let's show them it doesn't. The Dominion soldiers moved in tight formation, scanning the ruins of the jungle with disciplined efficiency. They had switched to heavier armor, adapted their sensors to compensate for heat distortion. They expected the same tactics. Silent kills. Ambushes. Navarro smirked. Not this time. He tapped his communicator once. The explosion ripped through the clearing a moment later, sending a Dominion transport sprawling onto its side, metal shrieking as it collapsed. The blast had been timed perfectly, its shockwave driving the enemy into disarray. Before they could recover, Martinez's rifle cracked from the trees, picking off stragglers with ruthless precision. Okoye and the others surged forward, rifles barking in the haze. Dominion soldiers scrambled to return fire, but the humans moved too fast, too unpredictably. Smoke and flame turned the battlefield into a shifting, chaotic hellscape, and the enemy's rigid formations collapsed in the disorder. One of the Dominion's war machines, a towering bipedal mech, lurched into view, its twin cannons swiveling toward Navarro's team. Before it could fire, Martinez dropped from the canopy above, a scavenged plasma blade slicing through exposed cables at its neck. The machine spasmed, weapons locking up, and Navarro finished it with a well-placed charge, watching as it toppled backward into the wreckage of its own transport. They had started this war in the shadows. Now, they were taking the fight into the open. Dominion Command would not ignore this loss. They would escalate further. That was expected. Navarro welcomed it. Zeltar's fist slammed into the holotable, his rage barely contained. How? He demanded. How do they keep slipping past our defenses? The officers before him did not answer. He could feel their unease, their uncertainty. The humans were no longer just ghosts in the jungle. They were striking with intent, precision. And worse, they were using Dominion technology. The latest battle reports confirmed it. Their own weapons turned against them. Their own tactics mirrored and refined. Each engagement revealed a horrifying truth. The humans were no longer just adapting to the war. They were winning it. Vrash stood rigid, his voice careful. General, we must consider. We consider nothing, Zeltar snapped. Deploy the cybernetic vanguard. I want these creatures annihilated. Vrash hesitated. The vanguard is still untested in prolonged engagements. They will have their test, Zeltar growled. He turned to holomap, watching the shifting lines of control. The jungle was disappearing, the battlefield changing. The humans could not hide forever. Soon, this war would reach its final stage, and Zeltar would ensure it ended with Dominion supremacy. The jungle had died, but the war had not. The once vast canopy, thick with vines and ancient trees, had been reduced to smoldering wastelands. Blackened husks stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers, the air thick with the acrid stench of burnt earth. The Dominion had reshaped the battlefield in their image, scorched bare and stripped of its wild chaos. Where once the jungle had hidden the human resistance, now there was nothing but open ground and hard edges. And yet, the humans remained. General Zeltar stood atop a command platform, surveying the wasteland through the cold, analytical lens of his visor. Below, his cybernetic vanguard advanced in rigid precision, towering bipedal machines, their metal limbs gleaming, their weapons designed to sweep away anything that still crawled through the ashes. These were the Dominion's finest constructs, immune to fear, impervious to deception. They did not tire. They did not hesitate. There would be no more ambushes, no more vanishing into the underbrush. The humans had been driven into the open, and here Zeltar would crush them. A transmission crackled over the command channel. Perimeter secured. No human activity detected. Zeltar did not relax. The silence was not a victory. It was an absence. A void where his enemies should have been. The jungle had been their weapon, their shield. Without it, they should have been vulnerable. And yet they did not surrender. They did not scatter. They adapted. Zeltar felt it before he saw it. A shift in the wind, a subtle distortion in the air. Then the first machine fell. One moment, it stood tall, scanning the ruins for threats. The next, it collapsed in a heap of sparking limbs, a jagged gash carved through its central processor. No explosion, no warning, just death. Then another fell, and another. Zeltar's mandibles twitched. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't desperate resistance. This was control. Calculated, precise. He switched to thermal imaging, scanning the battlefield. Nothing. The humans weren't hiding in the jungle anymore. They were the jungle. A squad of Dominion soldiers broke formation, panic setting in as they searched for an enemy they couldn't see. A shadow moved behind them, not from the ruins, not from the ground, from above. Martinez fired the first shot, a stolen Dominion rifle sending a plasma bolt clean through an officer's skull. Before the body hit the ground, Navarro was among them, blade flashing. The humans didn't fight like soldiers anymore. They fought like predators, striking from angles the Dominion wasn't prepared for, moving through the skeletal remains of the jungle with an ease that defied all expectation. The Dominion had taken their forest, so they made the ruins their own. Okoye detonated a series of charges along a ridgeline, sending a cascade of shattered rock and debris into a Dominion outpost. Martinez's shots never missed, picking off officers before they could relay orders. Navarro led the charge, his movements effortless, weaving through the chaos with brutal efficiency. This was no longer a war. It was a hunt. Zeltar's claws tightened around the railing. The battle was unraveling. His cybernetic vanguard, designed for overwhelming frontal assaults, was crumbling. Their rigid formations, so effective in traditional warfare, meant nothing against an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. Then the transmission came, not from his own ranks, from the humans. "You didn't take the jungle from us." Navarro's voice crackled through the Dominion's encrypted channel. "You gave it to us." Zeltar's eyes widened. The humans had never been retreating. They had never been losing ground. They had evolved. The jungle had been a weapon, yes, but not their only one. The moment the Dominion had stripped it away, the humans had forged something new. They had turned the battlefield into their hunting ground. A deafening explosion rocked the command platform, sending Zeltar sprawling. Flames licked at the edges of his armor as his visor flickered with a barrage of incoming distress signals. Units overwhelmed, perimeters collapsing. The turning point had come, and it did not belong to the Dominion. Smoke hung heavy over the battlefield, thick and cloying, the scent of burnt metal mingling with something deeper, something primal. The jungle had died, but its spirit had never left. It had been reborn, not in the trees, not in the vines, but in the warriors who had learned its ways. The The war was over. The Dominion had lost. Navarro stood amidst the wreckage, his rifle hanging loosely in his grip. Around him, his team moved in silence, scavenging what they could, ensuring no enemy remained breathing. There were no cries of victory, no shouts of celebration. War was not a thing to be celebrated, only survived. Okoye knelt beside a fallen Dominion officer, prying a data chip from the corpse's wrist terminal. "This'll have their last transmissions," she muttered. "Might be useful." Martinez wiped blood from his knife, nodding toward the horizon, where the last remnants of the Dominion's forces fled toward the sky. "They're running." Navarro exhaled slowly. No, not running. Retreating. And retreat was a wound that festered. He had seen it before, on Earth, in smaller wars, when arrogance was met with consequence. The Dominion would not forget this defeat, but they would remember it in the wrong way. "They'll come back," Martinez continued. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they will." Navarro looked to the sky, where the dying light of the day cast long shadows over the ruins of war. "Let them." He turned away, walking toward the wreckage of a Dominion command post, its shattered structure barely holding itself together. Inside, a flickering holodeable still pulsed with broken data feeds, distorted reports of a battle that should have been a massacre, a battle where the prey had become the predators. He tapped the console, forcing it to life. Across the stars, Dominion Command would be watching, listening. He had no illusions about what kind of empire they were. One that crushed resistance before it could take root, that erased threats before they could grow. They would twist this loss into something palatable, something that soothed their pride, unless he made sure they couldn't. He leaned in close to the transmitter. "This is Captain Elias Navarro of Earth's Jungle Special Forces," he said, his voice calm, unshaken. "To any Dominion commanders watching, to any empire that thinks itself untouchable, listen carefully." He gestured, and Okoye activated the data chip. The transmission shifted, feeding in every intercepted distress call, every broken cry from the Dominion forces who had thought themselves invincible. Images of shattered war machines, of bodies dragged into the underbrush, of soldiers too afraid to speak before their voices were silenced forever. Navarro let it play. Let them hear it. Let them feel it. Then he spoke again. "You thought Earth's wilderness was something to mock. You thought our jungles were nothing but trees and dirt." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Now you understand. The jungle is not a place. It is not a battlefield. It is not something you can burn away." He leaned closer, voice lowering to something colder, more certain. "The jungle is us, and we do not forgive." He cut the transmission. Outside, the fire still smoldered. The war had ended, but Navarro knew better than to believe in peace. The Dominion would return, or another empire would take its place. It didn't matter. The jungle had taught them how to fight, and when the next war came, the jungle would be waiting.